In September 1178, a French master mason named William of Salz stood on a wooden scaffold suspended 50 feet above the stone floor of Canterbury Cathedral. He was there to inspect a newly completed vault, a masterpiece of architectural precision. Suddenly, the wood splintered, the scaffolding collapsed, and William plummeted to the hard pavement below. He survived the fall, but his body was shattered. For nearly a year, he directed the cathedral's construction from his bed, passing instructions through a deputy before finally returning to France to die. William was the most celebrated architect of his generation, yet he was broken by the very structure he was hired to create. This was the true cost of medieval Europe's great cathedrals. It wasn't just measured in decades of labor or tons of silver, but in human lives, lost by the dozens on every monument that dared to reach for the sky.
Today, we walk through the brutal, uncompromising world of the medieval stonemason. We will follow the journey of the 14-year-old apprentice, trace the rise of the master who could map out a 400-foot spire using nothing but a rope and a pair of compasses, and witness the sudden demise of a guild that vanished in a single generation when the crown stopped paying. To understand these men, we have to look at what they called themselves. The medieval stonemason didn't use the titles we use today. He called himself a Freemason. This didn't mean he belonged to a secret society. It meant he was a worker of freestone, the soft, high-quality limestone that could be intricately carved with a chisel rather than just split apart with heavy hammers. By the year 1300, these Freemasons had become the highest-paid skilled tradesmen in Northern Europe outside of elite soldiers. A master mason working at York Minster or Salisbury Cathedral in the late 13th century could bring home around 8 pences a day. To put that in perspective, an ordinary English farm labourer during the same era earned just a penny and a half. The perks of the job were unmatched for a medieval peasant. A Freemason ate meat at the lodge table, owned a personal set of specialized tools, and was housed comfortably by the cathedral for the entire duration of the project. Perhaps most importantly, he possessed a rare freedom. He could cross heavily guarded international borders that would have gotten any other peasant arrested for simply leaving their home parish. But none of these privileges were given away freely. To earn even a fraction of this status, a boy had to give up his youth, starting at the brutal age of 14.
Entering the craft meant signing an unyielding contract. The young apprentice was bound to a master for a fixed term, usually lasting between 5 and 7 grueling years. During this entire period, the boy received absolutely no wages. His compensation consisted entirely of food, a hard patch of space to sleep on the lodge floor, and the hard-earned right to be taught the secrets of the trade. In exchange, he surrendered his entire existence to the master. He carried heavy stones until his back ached, fetched endless buckets of water, held large wooden templates perfectly still while the master cut, and swept the dusty stone-cutting floor at the end of every 10-hour shift. The restrictions were absolute. A mason's apprentice at Strasbourg in the 14th century was legally forbidden from leaving the city limits without written permission from his master. He was not allowed to marry, he could not strike any financial deals of his own, and he could not even possess his own tools. The chisels and mallets belonged entirely to the lodge. They were issued at the start of every shift and meticulously counted back in at nightfall. The first year of this life had almost nothing to do with shaping grand cathedrals. It was a brutal crash course in metallurgy and tool maintenance. The boy learned to forge his own chisels from raw iron blanks supplied by the lodge smith. He learned to temper the metal, setting the cutting edge at a razor-sharp angle for soft limestone, a slightly blunter angle for sandstone, and the toughest, heaviest edge for unforgiving granite. He trained his muscles to swing a heavy wooden mallet for 10 hours a day without his shoulder failing. He learned the survival rules of the high scaffold, which stones were safe to step on, which ones to avoid entirely, and exactly what a deadly, invisible hairline crack sounded like under a delicate tap test. By the second year, the apprentice was finally trusted to touch the stone. He began by dressing rough blocks, squaring them, smoothing the faces, and cutting bedding joints to a perfectly flat plane so they would sit tightly against the next block without wobbling. It was monotonous, back-breaking labor, but it was the foundation of everything. A mason who could not square a block perfectly could never be trusted with anything else. By year 3, he graduated to cutting molded stones, using full-size wooden templates handed down by the master. These templates were borne on the tracing floor, a large flat plaster surface laid out in the secure center of the lodge, which was carefully re-leveled every few months. At York Minster, this medieval tracing floor actually survives to this day. From the complex geometry drawn directly onto that plaster, wooden templates were cut, and from those pieces of wood, every single archstone, window mullion, and ceiling rib in the cathedral was shaped on the ground before being lifted an inch into the air. By the 4th year, the apprentice was working on intricate profile moldings, decorative cornices, and complex window tracery. This was the turning point that separated the true banker mason, a craftsman skilled enough to carve the visible finished surfaces, from the hewer who would do nothing but rough walling stones for the rest of his life. Finally, in year 5, after the master signed off, the young mason cut his own unique mark into a stone for the very first time. This mark was his legal signature. A 1306 contract from Lincoln Cathedral reveals how strict this was. Plain walling stones were paid by measured length, verified by the specific mason's mark cut into them. If a stone failed, the lodge knew exactly who to blame. If it held for 800 years, they knew that too. But the training wasn't over. After 5 years on one site, the lodge required a wanderjahr, a full year of mandatory travel. Carrying a sealed letter from his master, the journeyman walked from city to city, stopping at different cathedral lodges for weeks at a time to learn regional secrets. A mason from Strasbourg might walk all the way to Vienna, Cologne, or Basel, picking up a new approach to vaulting at every single stop. He slept where the rough road led him and ate on lodge charity. Only after this grueling journey was complete could he be promoted to a journeyman, and decades later, a master.
The institution that bound this international network together was called the Bauhütte. It was the most strictly regulated workplace in the medieval world, operating on a system that modern engineering still struggles to fully replicate.
You see, the medieval master mason did not work from numerical blueprints. He worked entirely from pure geometry. In the Middle Ages, there was no standardized unit of measurement that crossed borders. The foot used in Paris was completely different from the foot used in London, and the measurement used in Strasbourg differed wildly from the one used in Vienna. Yet cathedrals built hundreds of miles apart share identical, flawless, proportional relationships. The secret was a method called ad quadratum, or according to the square. The master mason would lay out a single base square on the earth using nothing but a peg, a rope, and a large pair of iron compasses. To generate the next proportional module for the building, he would rotate that square 45 degrees and draw a new square whose sides ran precisely through the midpoints of the first. Mathematically, the ratio between those two squares is exactly 1 to the square root of 2. By stacking that geometric module up the elevation of the structure, the entire cathedral emerged organically out of pure geometry, without a single person ever measuring a specific length in inches or feet. A second method, ad triangulum, worked from the equilateral triangle, producing a ratio of 1 to the square root of 3 over 2. We know these design systems were fiercely debated on site. In 1391, the Lombard masters laying out the massive Milan cathedral hit a critical crisis. Their ground plan generated a theoretical height that could not be cleanly resolved. To fix it, they summoned a famous mathematician from Piacenza named Gabriele Stornalocco. On October 13, 1391, Stornalocco delivered a written opinion rounding the impossible theoretical height of 83.1 units to 84 units so it could be divided cleanly into 6 perfect modules of 14. This document stands as the earliest written record in human history of a cathedral's architectural proportions being negotiated and solved on a live worksite. The physical evidence of this incredible geometric genius survived in the personal notebooks of the builders themselves. The most famous example sits in the French National Library in Paris, the sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt, drawn between 1225 and 1235. Across 40 pages of parchment, Villard documented the architecture of Reims Cathedral using only a compass and a straight edge. His drawings show how to square a circle, how to transfer a massive vault profile to a tiny piece of parchment, and how to derive a window's complex proportions from a simple generating polygon. There is not a single number or measurement written on any of those pages. This geometric mastery is exactly why the banker mason was indispensable. Once the master drew the lines on the tracing floor, the blocks were cut to those exact templates on the ground. Stones arrived at the top of the wall, pre-fitted. The masons working high on the scaffolds weren't shaping stone in the sky. They were simply assembling a massive, heavy puzzle whose exact dimensions had been settled in plaster weeks before. That is why the mortar joints on surviving Gothic masonry are incredibly tight. By the time a mason finally reached the prestigious rank of master, he had spent at least 20 years on dangerous building sites. He had survived the grueling apprenticeship, the mandatory wanderings, and a lengthy journeyman period. He had cut stone for a dozen different cathedrals across multiple countries, and, tragically, he had buried many of his closest colleagues. Falls were a constant, terrifying reality of the job. The scaffolding was made of rough timber, lashed together with hemp rope, and it had to be constantly disassembled and moved upward as the stone walls climbed higher. A 90-foot drop onto solid stone flagstones meant instant death. The work was also brutally seasonal. Frost is the ultimate enemy of lime mortar. If water freezes inside the uncured joints, it expands and shatters the masonry. Because of this, every cathedral lodge in northern Europe completely shut down its scaffolds between St. Martin's Day in November and Easter. The entire workforce was laid off for the winter. These men went home, walked south in search of warmer climates, or relied on the charity of brother lodges just to survive the freezing months. There was no winter work, and there was absolutely no winter pay. Because of these conditions, very few masons ever saw the completion of the cathedral they spent their lives building. Salisbury Cathedral took 38 years to construct, which was considered incredibly fast for the era. Chartres Cathedral took the better part of a century. Cologne Cathedral was started in the year 1248, but it wasn't officially finished until 1880. The masons who carved the heavy foundation stones at Cologne died more than 600 years before the towering spires were finally completed. What kept these men coming back to the dust and the danger was the sheer brilliance of the engineering. A flying buttress carries 1,000 years of accumulated architectural wisdom in a single stone strut, redirecting the immense outward thrust of the roof safely down into the earth. Pointed arches funnel gravity directly into vertical columns. Intricate ribbed vaults concentrate the weight of a massive stone ceiling onto 4 precise points instead of spreading it across a heavy wall, allowing the walls themselves to become vibrant walls of stained glass.
The medieval mason didn't understand structural engineering in modern terms. He didn't draw complex force diagrams or calculate load paths on paper, but he knew exactly what worked because he had watched it succeed, building after building, passing that hard-earned knowledge directly from master to apprentice for 4 centuries. Every single stone was doing a critical job. If you remove the flying buttress, the nave walls buckle. If you remove the ribbed vault, the weight crushes the wrong sections of the structure. If you remove the pointed arch, the lateral force tears the entire cathedral apart. The building was a living, breathing, integrated system. By the late 14th century, this system was highly organized. Lodges across the Holy Roman Empire operated under unified rules, standardized training, and cross-recognition of journeyman papers. A mason qualified in Cologne could walk directly into a lodge in Vienna and be put to work on the high scaffolds that very same week. On April 25, 1459, 17 cathedral master builders met at Regensburg to formalize these ancient oral traditions into written law, creating the earliest surviving training standards for the craft. But by the time those laws were updated a century later, the entire world had changed. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. By the 1530s, the wealthy monasteries and cathedral chapters that had funded these grand projects for 400 years were being systematically dissolved across northern Europe. In England, King Henry VIII dismantled the monasteries between 1536 and 1541. Cathedral funds dried up instantly. The critical revenue from traveling pilgrims vanished. The lucrative sale of indulgences evaporated overnight. The great lodges emptied. Apprentices had no masters to learn from because the masters had no commissions to keep them employed. The continuous, unbroken chain of architectural technique that had been passed down mouth to mouth on the windy scaffolds for 4 centuries was broken in a single generation. By the late 17th century, the work in cathedral lodges had transformed into something else entirely: social fraternities and speculative Freemasonry. It became the memory of an ancient craft that no longer built anything out of stone. Yet the monuments they left behind still stand. Salisbury Cathedral has stood firm on a shallow chalk foundation since 1220. Durham Cathedral has held its ground since 1093. Winchester Cathedral has successfully stood for over 800 years on top of a shifting peat bog. These buildings outlived the empires, the kings, and the religious revolutions that sought to reshape Europe. The men who raised them worked on scaffolds that killed their friends, gave up their youth to unpaid apprenticeships, and walked across continents just to perfect their craft. They cut their personal marks into the hidden faces of the stone, fully understanding that the grand monuments they were creating would outlive them by hundreds of years. The cathedrals are still standing. The men who knew how to build them are gone forever.